to Archives Live. I'm Chrishayla Smith, and today I'm here with David Peters and Kurt Anderson, who are both part of the OSU Archives. And today we are celebrating Women's History Month, and we're talking about the one and only Angie Debo. Are you all ready to talk about Angie?
You bet. Yeah, sure are.
It's gonna be great. If you have any questions about Angie Debo or any of her works, you can send your questions in the comment section below, and we'll get to them throughout this live. Many of our viewers don't know that we're actually in the Angie Debo room, which is where we do most of our lives. Can you tell us a bit about Angie Debo?
Well, Angie Debo was a remarkable woman. She was born in north central Kansas. Her parents were pioneers in Oklahoma. They moved to Oklahoma in 1899, I believe. They settled in Marshall, Oklahoma. She was unable to complete high school until age 22 because they didn't have a high school in town until that point. Then she goes and gets a she goes an undergraduate degree at the University of Oklahoma, gets a master's degree at University of Chicago, comes back to the University of Oklahoma and gets a PhD in history. During that time, she works for about 10 years in Canyon, Texas, in the history department and as a curator of a museum there, but becomes a remarkable historian and scholar, and is especially known for her work with Native American history, and specifically Native American history revolving groups in Oklahoma. She was also a civil rights advocate, equal rights advocate, and was just a general, very progressive individual and supported the causes of others. So just a remarkable woman.
Yeah. So you're sitting in her chair, her actual chair. How did her stuff end up here at Oklahoma State University?
Well, so Oklahoma State University, Henry Bennett provided the opportunity for Angie to provide or to have employment here near the end of her career, really. And so she was the first curator of the map room, and she worked for the OSU Library. I think she felt a special kinship with Oklahoma State University. So even though she has no degrees from this institution, her estate was willed to the library. And so we have both her papers, many of her books, and then also personal items from her home, including this chair. This is the chair that she sat in when Charles Banks Wilson was doing the portrait of her that hangs in the state capitol. So that's why this chair is kind of special. But we have a number of other items from Angie and from people in Marshall who she was friends with. She was very generous to her friends, and many of those individuals, their families have now donated items that they received from Angie Debo.
Cool. And we get to look at it in this office. That's really cool. Kurt, you've been working with Angie Debo's, all her papers and things like that. How's that been?
Oh, it's been very satisfying. My own personal background is in Indian histories and Western history, and that's what Angie Debo specialized in. She's perhaps best known for her Indian histories, but she also wrote Western histories and Oklahoma histories from the viewpoint of Anglo-American expansion westward. And I started with the collection to kind of investigate a paradox. She's almost universally praised for her Indian histories because they were so original, and she's really the first scholar who wrote what we now call ethnohistory, where she included pieces about the Indians' cultures and their practices and beliefs, as well as just the documentary history. Very, very original. She's credited with actually almost inventing what's called the new Indian history now. But scholars have also been a little more critical of some of her other works because they seem to feel that she adhered to what has now become kind of a discredited perspective, the the Turner thesis of westward expansion. And so because what she studied is my own personal background, I spent quite a bit of time investigating why some of her works would be so praised and some of her works would be so criticized. It's been really rewarding, and I think I'm getting close to the answer. And then the second project I undertook, one of her most significant, if not her most significant books, was her study of the dispossession of the 5 southeastern tribes' lands in Oklahoma. around the turn of the 20th century. And she saw that same process happening to the Alaska Natives. And in her 80s, it's a remarkable story, in her 80s, long after she could have just sat in her home and just enjoyed her fame and her financial security at last, she undertook a 2-year project to mobilize an entire network of people across the country. She went to Washington and testified in behalf of the Alaska Natives. And the results of her efforts, hers and a whole bunch of other folks, the Indians actually, for the first time, got a fair deal. And they were awarded 40 million acres of Alaska and a huge cash compensation from Alaska's mineral wealth. It's an amazing story.
Wow, it's a powerful woman. So you have all this information on her. What exactly are you doing with it?
Well, for my first report, I actually prepared, is about a 500-page report that just traces the trajectory of her scholarship, going all the way back to her undergraduate work and then her master's program, and through her publication of a book that she published on the spirit of Oklahoma in 1949. So I've been covering basically from her birth through about 1950, okay, about 60 years of her life. And then the other project, I'm just in the beginning stages of that, going through her correspondence and how she actually mobilized this widespread network of friends and acquaintances and government officials, and it's a really remarkable story.
Wow, it's amazing. If you're just now joining us, we are here in the Angie Debo room. I'm with David Peters and Kurt Anderson, and we're talking about Angie Debo. If you have any questions, feel free to send those questions in. Right now, we're going to take a look at questions we have so far. We have a question from Tatum Wallace. Well, she has 2 questions. Well, one of her questions is, how did Angie Debo make a difference for future women at OSU?
Her story is so remarkable because she wrote at a time when it was very difficult for women to secure academic jobs at major universities. And what's really sad about her story, in a way, is that she was more accomplished than a lot of men who applied for the same positions that she applied for. But because she was a woman, she was not offered the jobs. And this happened throughout her career. And it was eventually it became so frustrating that she just decided to make a career as a writer rather than an academic. And I think that would be a very inspiring story for women today who read her biography, or who would go through her collection, for instance, and read some of her correspondence and just discover some of the frustrations. It might inspire women who feel that maybe they're facing some obstacles in their own personal lives and careers today.
I think for anyone facing obstacles, she's exemplary in doing what she can to overcome what she can. There's things she couldn't control, and so she took advantage of those opportunities she did create, and showed just tremendous fortitude and resilience and flexibility. And I think it's an inspiration for not only women, but for anyone.
It's very true. We have another question from Bonnie Canewood, and her question is, for you, David. It says, David, can you tell us about the portrait of Angie Debo that hangs in the state capitol?
Okay, so that was commissioned and painted by Charles Banks Wilson. And so he came to Angie's home and began painting her and did sketches and then painted at her home. And so the background of the painting has like the books that she had written at that point. It's like I said, it's in the chair I'm sitting in right now. But it was from her home in Marshall. Charles Banks Wilson was the artist. And then they had a ceremony in the Capitol. She called it her hanging in the Capitol. She wasn't always received well by some of the politicians in the Oklahoma government, but in that case, it was an honor for her to be placed in the Capitol. So it's quite a unique portrait. We also have a copy of it in the second floor by the center elevator. In the center part of the building, there's a little Angie Debo area, part of the literary program, and we have a copy of the portrait that hangs in the Capitol.
A couple of years ago, I was at a conference and I spoke with a very well-known scholar, and she wrote an article about Angie Debo that was very perceptive. And after her presentation, I went up and spoke to her and told her that I was researching Angie Debo's collection. And she made the comment at the end of our conversation. She said, you know, what's so neat is, she said, Angie Debo's portrait in the Capitol hangs next to some of the very men that she exposed as corrupt crooks stealing lands from the Indians. You know, she thought that was a real special tribute to Angie Debo, you know, that she's hanging right there next to some of the men she exposed.
Interesting. So both of you have had the chance to work with some of her things in her collection. What's been your favorite part of working with it, or something you found that really stood out to you?
Well, the documentary collection it consists of over 60 boxes, and she was a hoarder. She saved everything, bless her heart. It's a wonderful collection. It's very comprehensive. It contains handwritten and typewritten manuscripts for all of her publications. And some of the things that I enjoy researching the most are her correspondence and her diaries. It's just remarkable. And I've come across some really fun things. Angie Debo had a wonderful sense of humor, very dry, and she didn't take herself too seriously. And she told a story once about when she was at the University of Chicago working on her master's degree, that she went to a graduate history dinner and she sat next to a young man by the name of Richard Loeb. And she was very taken with him. She thought he was very, very charming. And her roommate was dating a man by the name of Nathan Leopold. And turns out that these two young men, they were Chicago natives going to graduate school there at the University of Chicago. And they decided that they were smarter than everybody else and that they would commit the perfect crime. So they lured a 14-year-old boy into their car and killed him and disposed of the body. They were eventually arrested and convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment with 99 years. And Angie Debo, later on, she reflected that she had been so taken by this young man, and she realized how naive she was coming from rural Oklahoma into the big city. So just, there are fun things like that, you know, that I come across. It's just been a lot of fun.
And Kurt has done a lot more intensive study of her works than I have. But I do enjoy, even as a young girl, you know, she had diary entries. She was I think born to be a writer. She always recorded things, wrote things. She served as a secretary for a number of organizations. We still get notebooks in from different organizations in which Angie Debo served as a secretary. I think she loved to write. She loved to collect information and then make it available for others to see. And it's just remarkable to see throughout her whole life there's that continuum of writing and how important that was for her.
You're right about being born to be a writer. Some of her diary entries when she was only 8 or 9 years old, and she had had very little formal schooling, excuse me, but the writing in these diaries from an 8-year-old, it's remarkable. It's better than some of the students I've seen at OSU.
Okay, we have one more question. Actually, we got a few more questions, but we'll just do a couple right now, then we'll come back. Let's see. We have one from William Davis, and he says, well, that's kind of what I just asked you. What do you think is the most interesting piece in the Angie Debo collection?
I would have to say her correspondence.
Correspondence.
With the diaries being a strong second.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's, and still the waters run. We have the various manuscripts for first drafts or later drafts. I think it's interesting to see the change over time as she makes adjustments to that manuscript. And I think that's really kind of intriguing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, thank you, William, for asking that question. So, majority of her work is with Native American things and Native American culture and civil rights, things like that. What's something, or what's a story that you have or you found that's just stood out to you in those circumstances?
She always felt a little bit hesitant, excuse me, about writing about Indians because she wasn't an Indian. And she was worried that they might be offended, that she was trying to tell their story. And one of the things that she always found very, very gratifying was that she was welcomed into Indian communities. She was welcomed into their homes. They praised her Indian histories lavishly. And that always gratified her immensely, that she wasn't viewed as just an objective kind of standoff academic, that she was actually welcomed into their culture and into their lives.
Very interesting. Okay. We're going to answer a few more questions for our viewers. Anthony Jones asks, why did Debo choose to write about such controversial topics?
Actually, her first Indian history, the topic was suggested by her dissertation advisor, Edward Everett Dale, a very famous historian in his own right. The history building at OU is named after him. And he was a student of Frederick Jackson Turner, who was the creator of the thesis that I mentioned earlier that's somewhat been discredited. But anyway, he suggested the OU had this collection of Choctaw documents, and they'd never been researched. So he suggested that as a possible topic for her. And she always kind of laughed about how she didn't really pursue a topic before it just came on to her. In this case, Edward Everett Dale suggested the Choctaw study, and then the book that David mentioned, And Still the Waters Run. That was just a natural outgrowth of her research into the Choctaws. And then after she'd written those two books, then she decided she would do a study of the Creeks. And Larry McMurtry, the famous author of Lonesome Dove, calls those three books her Indian trilogy. And she talks quite a bit about how she came across various topics. Her study of the Creeks led into her book about Tulsa, the oil capital of Oklahoma, and just various things.
Very interesting. We have another question from Tatum Wallace. She says, in what ways did Angie Debo contribute to the advancement of women's rights in the state of Oklahoma?
Do you have an answer?
Well, I'll preface my answer by saying that I don't believe Angie Debo actually considered herself a feminist in the modern sense of the word, but what any woman could take from her as inspiration and a lesson in perseverance is how she did not let the obstacles that she experienced as a woman in the time that she wrote and at the time that she was making her career, she never let that stop her. So I would say, that even though she's not considered perhaps one of the early feminists, and she didn't look at herself that way, I don't believe, she certainly is a woman that any woman in Oklahoma or anywhere could look up to as a model, a role model.
I think she also had an ability to create community, and with community you have strength. And so if it's just one person wailing against something, you have challenges. But she knew how to build relationships with other individuals and build these communities. I think it's especially symbolic of the community she grew up in Marshall, Oklahoma. She was tied to that community, and they were tied to her. But I think she used that same sense of community building in these other activities as she was trying to reach out and make differences. And so I think she helped women connect with each other and support each other. And so I think that was one way of supporting women's opportunities in the state.
Very good. We have one last question, and this is from another question from Bonnie Canewood. And her question, she says, there are so many books and memorabilia in the Angie Debo room. Can you tell us about some of the items we might find in the room?
There's some of her awards. There's photographs from her family. Several years ago, we were contacted by an individual from the Carolinas who had her family album. How it got to Carolina, we're not sure, but they graciously were willing to send it our way. So we have the photo album that she and her brother Edwin gave to their parents, I think in 1898 or 1899. I think it was maybe in the first year when they were here in Oklahoma. But it's got the family pictures in there. I like that album. But there's also little things. She visited the pyramids in Egypt, and we have some rubble or rock from the pyramid. And actually, she gave that to one of her friends in Marshall, who then later gave it to us. It's just we have a number of little items that she had saved and she found meaningful, and hopefully we provided a place for them to be shown. So.
And of course her book collection.
In her book collection.
You can learn a lot about someone by looking at the titles of books they read, and she has a wonderful, very extensive book collection. And then another thing that has always intrigued me is her typewriter. We have her typewriter, her last typewriter, and she named them all. I think this one was named Pegasus. She named them after Greek mythology figures. So
she kind of considered them her co-writers.
Yes, yes.
So.
Yep.
So very cool. So can people come in and just visit this room? Do they need to make appointments?
So the archives is generally open 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, and so if someone wants to visit the room during that time, we welcome them to come in, and we're glad to show them. Outside of that time or during breaks, then we'll need to make arrangements prior to that. But they can contact the archives, and we can make arrangements for people to come visit the Angie Debo room here in the library.
Okay. And how can people access her collection of all these things we have?
So online, we have a Content DM collection as part of our digital collections. And so there's an Angie Debo collection online. You can look at some of her materials that have been digitized. We have her photo collection. Most of that has been digitized, so you can look at the photographs that she had. We're working on some other projects which will make more of her material available, hopefully in the near future. But there is a page for Angie Debo on Content DM, and there's additional information they can find there about her. Plus, we have inventories too. If they want to see inventories, we have inventories for her collection in the archives.
Okay, very good. Before we go, are there any collections or projects you all are working on with other women? Or about other women?
Well, we just are in the process of accepting a collection of Girl Scout memorabilia. And so these were women who were involved with scouting. And so this has been a collaborative project with the oral history program here. But we'll be accepting a number of images from Girl Scouting in Oklahoma, which is kind of a little different but interesting, I think.
Yeah, sounds very cool. We thank you all for tuning in and joining us on this Archive Live, and we thank you everyone out there who sent in your questions. We hope we got those answered for you all. Thank you, Kurt and David, for answering all those questions and sharing all this wonderful information about Angie Debo and inviting us into the Angie Debo room. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on Archives Live.